There's a myth going round town that when you get older you just sit down and start rocking, just rocking. In a way that's true, if you know what I mean. Just take a look at the senior scene. Well, it's rockin'. Yeah, it's rockin'. We're pulling our weight, learning the code.
Welcome to In Praise of Age. We're so glad you joined us. This program is about issues that relate to seniors and affect them. We try to educate as well as let people know what's going on. And today we have a very special person on our program, Thomas Goldsmith, who's a generation reporter for the News and Observer. And I'm going to call him Tommy, if he'll call me Florence.
That sounds great.
And Tommy, you came when to the News and Observer?
I came from Nashville, Tennessee, where I'd lived for about 30 years in April of 2003. I was features editor for about 2.5 years, I guess. And I've been the generations reporter since April of last year, 2006. In that role, I cover all aspects of aging and intergenerational relationships. It's everything from issues at the state legislature to medical problems or issues that older people face, good news stories about old people, historical stories. It's really a wonderful beat because my view is that if I'm told to write about or asked to write about older people, that just means writing about people because older people essentially do everything that anyone else does.
But you in many ways grew up in the Triangle area, did you not?
I did. My dad was at UNC, Richard W. Goldsmith, who is still with us down in Florida, was a graduate student and an instructor at UNC, and this was in the early 50s. I was actually born at Duke Hospital because there was no Memorial Hospital yet. But I lived in Chapel Hill, and we lived here for several years and wound up in Raleigh when I was in about the first grade. And that's where I grew up, was in Raleigh.
And you left Raleigh when you were just finishing your teenage years?
Well, I came here to Chapel Hill, to UNC for a while, and I went to Nashville, Tennessee to be a musician. And was there as a musician for about 11 years, and then got into the newspaper business pretty much from the ground up. I really started as a part-timer, doing anything that anyone would let me do because I loved writing and was interested in news and interested in meeting people and finding out about areas of life outside music, to which I dedicated myself for a number of years. And then I moved up the ranks, I'll say immodestly. I wound up as assistant managing editor of the News and Observer of the Tennessean in Nashville, and was ready for a change. I have two sons, and my wife grew up in Nashville and was ready to try someplace else, so we came here.
So, and you were the first generations reporter for the News and Observer, is that correct?
That's right. We had other people write at different times, including Bill Kruger, who's now our state editor.
Right.
Wrote some really strong stories about nursing homes a few years ago. But they were restructuring the newsroom, and Melanie Sill, our editor, asked me to take on a beat, and rather than be called the aging reporter, I suggested the name generations reporter. I'm conscious enough of my own aging. I didn't want that to be my title, but it really has been great. I've met a lot of interesting people, and there are, as you know, a number of people in this area who are doing important, interesting, and forward-looking work on aging issues.
And along with this, you cover the whole state, or are you basically assigned to the Triangle area?
Well, generally, we think our readership is most interested in issues that are close to home. So, yes, I write a lot about Wake County and Orange, Durham, Johnston. But the issues of state government, of course, are statewide. So I've written about cases in Buncombe County and down by the coast, and a number of laws and regulations that, of course, cover every citizen of North Carolina.
Let's talk a little bit about newspaper business and what's happening. I noted in the News Observer on Sunday that most of your readers are elders, the majority. Young people are not reading newspapers these days.
That is true across the newspaper business. Unfortunately, from our point of view, and I think for the young people too, Younger people are used to getting news online, to some degree from television. They're not in the habit as much of picking up a newspaper as, I'm 55, so we were surrounded by newspapers in my childhood. We had the News and Observer and the Raleigh Times and the New York Times on Sunday, lots of news magazines. And so across the industry, there's sort of a 1-2 punch, which is unfortunate, the lack of younger readers, and a fall off in advertising, mostly in classified advertising. So that's affecting newspaper revenues. But it's making us adapt, change the way we do things. In some cases, return to news fundamentals, getting news out there first and best. And so we think, as an industry, there is a future for news reporting and writing of the type that we do. It's going to be, the news is appearing now at the N&O and other newspapers across many more platforms. We have a substantial and growing internet presence. We have video online. We have lots of pictures online. We have resources, which I can tell you more about in a little bit vis-a-vis aging. So we want people to think of the News and Observer as an information resource on a lot of different levels. There's no doubt that newspapers are going through a transition.
Right.
I talked to a group of students last night and noted that in the last 5 or 6 years, you've seen the music industry largely transform the way it delivers its product.
Right.
You have an easy, fun, relatively inexpensive way to obtain music. You can download it from your computer. Most people do that into iTunes or some program like that. You can put it on your little iPod and carry around, what once would have been hundreds or thousands of albums or CDs or cassettes. It's all right there whenever you want it, as much as you want it, and where you want it. Newspapers are not yet at that point. I mean, you can download podcasts and different things into your iPod, but I think that we're still searching for a delivery method which will give that sort of cachet and ease and, frankly, fun quality that other media have now developed.
Now, one of the other issues that was in the News and Observer on Sunday, talking about newspapers, was the fact that many people no longer trust. It's the ethics issue.
Well, there were some very high
surprised
profile.
me.
Yeah, there were some very high profile incidents at the New York Times, at the New Republic, at various other media of unscrupulous, unprofessional, and very unfortunate people who, very frankly did the wrong thing. I can tell you that that's very rare. I mean, I've been in daily newspapers for 24 years. Most people, we always say this, and I think it's true, most people who do what we do could do something else.
Right.
And people do leave. They would leave to become lawyers or PR people, or some of them go to work for corporations and become spokesmen or women or whatever. Most of us love the work we do. It is rewarding. It allows you to write. It allows you to meet people and all of that. It takes a real aberration, in my view, for that sort of unscrupulous conduct to prevail for any length of time. People also think newspapers are biased. As an editor, I took calls like that all the time. Sometimes we would run a story, and people from one side of the political spectrum would call and say, clearly you're biased to the other side. And then people from the other side would call and say, oh, clearly you're biased to the other way. And I think, oh, we must have been pretty balanced because they're both angry at us.
Right.
We spend a lot of time and thought on trying to make our coverage balanced. I mean, the great thing about a newspaper is it comes out every day. We don't always do the best possible job. We strive very hard to do that. And if we run a picture, the campaign season is coming up again. If we have a large picture of one person who's running for president on one day, we may have a large picture of the other the next day. And I've seen all sorts of experiments with this, running them exactly the same size, which is a designer's nightmare. You want a larger picture as the focal point for your page. But we really try hard, and we more than ever now, we're inviting public input.
And do you have sort of a community advisory committee or something?
We have several opportunities for that. One thing I would really recommend, especially for older people who might be a little freer to do this, you're welcome to come into our afternoon news meeting. People often want to know when and where the stories are chosen for 1A. There's a meeting that involves about 20 people that takes place every afternoon, every weekday. You can call up, and the main number is 829-4500. It's 829-4500, and you can listen to presentation of stories. You can listen to the discussion. You You can listen to questions about fairness and accuracy. Do we absolutely know this? Are we, we're writing a story about Beverly Perdue. Is this a fair story given that she's a candidate for governor?
Right.
Do we need to give equal time? Is this, frankly, we'd say, is this her effort, to boost her profile? Is it really newsy, or do we need to take that into consideration? So you can come in and go to news meetings. We'll ask you what you think. At the end of the week, you can tell us, well, and I used to be in those meetings, and very often the person would say, I'm surprised at the amount of time you spend making these choices and the parameters you use by which to make those choices. There's also an extended panel that Ted has of hundreds of people that are on email that he sends out a question to, what do you think about this? Are we doing too much of this? Are we doing too much of that? And then there's the community panel, which has maybe 12 people on it. And I think you stay on that for 6 months. I'm not exactly sure of that, but you meet with Ted, and then various people come in and do presentations, like editorial or sports, or somebody will come in and say, here's how we do what we do. No, we're not really biased in favor of UNC Chapel Hill. We give equal space to everyone. But there are many, I think more than most corporations, we are transparent and open to the public. And thus it should be. We're mentioned, the press, as a former editor always used to say, we're the only business mentioned in the Constitution of the United States.
Right.
We are protected to some degree under the Constitution in ways that other businesses are not. And we take it very seriously.
The other issue I think that people are concerned about with the ethics is how very few people are now controlling most of the newspapers.
Well, that's correct, but they're
and is this going to create a problem for the truth coming out? I don't know.
My view, I think one thing you're referring to is that the company that owns us, McClatchy Corp. Out of California,
Very
now
large.
also owns the Charlotte Observer. It bought the old Knight Ridder chain. We own McClatchy was not very many papers at one time. It was about 11 dailies. Now there are many more. Does that mean that we're going to sweep stuff under the rug? I think there are market forces at work there. If people don't see themselves, if they don't see factors that are affecting their lives, if they don't see misdeeds of public officials, if they don't see, potentially our own misdeeds in the paper, they let us know, and they stop reading the paper, which is the worst thing that can happen to us. I think one thing that protects against that is the emergence of the blogging classes and all the alternative media, the alternative radio stations on both sides of the voices on both sides of the political spectrum. So again, our credibility and our completeness and accuracy is our franchise. So I would like to think that people would rise up and protest if they think we are not fully and accurately reporting the news.
Let's go back a minute to your being the reporter for generations and talk about elders and what sort of things you want to cover, and when should they get in touch with you? What's important?
Well, for one thing, I wouldn't necessarily report this myself, but we have a lot of places that people can get their activities in the paper. If there is an event to which the public is invited, if it's just a small private event, we wouldn't publicize it, but we have listings of all sorts of different faith events, community events. If you have a health fair in your community, specifically for older people, we can get that in. So there's that just sort of informational purpose. If you know an interesting person that is worth a story, I would be glad to hear about that. We can't always do them, but I'd be glad to talk to anyone. There's sort of a good news, bad news factor in one aspect of that. People call and say, my aunt is turning 100. And I say, unless there's something really unusual about the person, my typical response is, I cannot tell you how pleased I am for your aunt and your family that she has lived to be 100, but a lot of people do these days.
Yes.
It used to be just that fact, right, the fastest growing segment in the population. So that alone would not necessarily make a story. If you have a concern about a public safety issue, about a public policy issue, now these get trickier, but if you have a consumer issue, about health insurance, about the way someone you know and love has been treated at a long-term care facility by an in-home care agency, I can talk to you about that. I may be able to refer you to a resource, someone who could help you get something done about that. Obviously, I can't really offer advice or counsel you on what to do.
Right.
I can say, as far as I know, people in these situations often go to resources for seniors
Right.
in Wake County or the Council on Aging in Orange and Durham counties.
Right.
So that's one time I would like people to get in touch. Really, I'm happy to talk to anyone. I really enjoy talking to readers. I enjoy talking to older people, partly because so many people in that age range are leading highly productive and interesting lives. They are doing stuff they want to do. They're staying healthy. They're aware of political, social, legal issues, and they, in many cases, are out doing something about it. So the short answer is, I'll talk to anybody.
I think one of the things that we forget is that the old people vote. The
Absolutely.
elders vote, and that's their power for people in political office.
And I think you saw some examples of that in the legislature this last term. There was a good bit of aging-related legislation that was introduced and a good bit that passed.
Right.
And you have, there's powerful forces and goodwill at work on both sides of many of these issues. I mean, I have a lot of admiration for people in the industry which takes care of older people in our state. And the great majority of those institutions, as far as I'm aware, does a good job in looking after older people. They have very tough, a tough job to do.
And they're paid poorly.
They're
usually.
paid poorly. The frontline workers are paid poorly in almost every case. And they are fighting to keep their funding up, to keep, from what they view as burdensome regulation, from keeping them from doing their job. And I talk to those people regularly. I talk to the representatives of the industry. I talk to individual operators, and I'm very glad to talk to them on, it amounts to another side, but you have people in the legislature who think that these facilities are not regulated enough, that there needs to be more regulation, there needs to be more infusion of state energy, and in some cases financing as well. So those forces, I think, often try to work together. I mean, when it gets time for different bills to be reconciled in conference or whatever, I think there were some examples this year of people actually working together on that. But there's a lot happening. There was a bill that was hotly contested that creates a rated certificate for adult care homes,
Right.
which the sponsors believed will provide really needed information for people that are entering that system. And a variety of other things that touched older
And
people's lives.
that did pass, we might say.
It did pass, right.
And you did a very nice article about educating people about it.
Well, that was, again, as we've discussed before, I'm not an advocate for anything,
But
for anyone but the readers.
Educationally, yeah.
Right. We wanted to get the word out there, and I'll hear from both sides. The industry will say, oh, well, you're not giving our side fully, or the people, if I do a story that represents the industry more fully, than I hear from the other side. But again, there's a flow of information that we try to provide that I think, if you look at it carefully over a period of time, will be fair and accurate.
Have you done any stories that stand out to you that sort of tear at your heartstrings and you wish?
Well, the stories, and then going and meeting people and talking to people. In the end, I feel great admiration for people. And I wrote about a gentleman, I'm sorry, I can't remember his last name, but he is a retired Navy captain over in Winston-Salem. And I went with a doctor who is part of a program at Wake Forest in which older people with mental illness get visits from physicians, from psychiatrists at home, which is a wonderful thing.
Right.
If you're, in what they call old, you're 92, as this gentleman was, you have mental illness. I mean, it's a real traumatic experience to be put in a car, taken to a clinic, sit at a clinic for a while, be taken into an examining room. What sort of helpful or meaningful answers are you going to give a physician? So we go to this person's home. The doctor from Wake Forest, Burton Reifler is his name, talks to just sort of asks orientation questions, and the gentleman is not oriented. I mean, he thinks it's 1934. He thinks he's in California. And then Dr. Reifler said, are you depressed. And this captain said, of course I'm depressed. I used to be a captain in the U.S. Navy. The core of that man was still who he was. You know, he was proud and brave. He remembered, you know, what a destroyer was, how many men it took to man one of those ships. He was perfectly in the moment as far as that went. I'm thinking, good for you. You know, you're not giving up. And so many people do not give up. And I just really admire that bravery.
Well, I think you're hitting on one of my major interests in geriatrics is going back in the person's life and letting them reminisce, because even despite dementia and other physical illnesses, they can relate to achievements that they've made, even though at the moment things do not look so bright for them, but they can see back. So look back.
And that's
very
useful.
important.
Right, and you know this better than I, but that's useful for families to know too.
Absolutely.
That you can't quiz, you know, your grandmother about what she did yesterday because she likely doesn't
remember. You want to ask her
it.
about 50 years
right,
ago.
Right. I met another gentleman. He has since died, I'm sorry to say, but a gentleman named Leon Spencer in Raleigh was 102. And I met him over at Whitaker Glen at a gathering of some people I know there. And I talked to Mr. Spencer and asked him about Seaboard, North Carolina, where he had grown up. And he was just wonderful talking about that. And it was about a half and half black and white city, and he talked about and this we're going back, you know, 80 years ago,
sure,
or 90 years ago. And then it ended up being a real blessing for me. He knew my grandfather, John Arch McMillan.
How exciting!
Who died before I was born. I think he died in 1949. And that was just great for me to. And he was funny. I said, so you knew John Arch and his brother? He said, yeah. The McMillans were generally good. And so he didn't try to put too pretty a picture on it, but he remembered my grandfather, which was wonderful. And I encourage people to go and, you know, either their relatives or, you know, be a visitor at an assisted living or a nursing home. Those people have, you know, in the course of a long life of 85 or 90 years, a lot of great stuff happens to you. You know,
absolutely.
You know, and they'd love to have someone new to whom they can tell their stories. Yeah. Absolutely.
Because the families may or may not, but the other thing is to encourage the families to record that.
Right, absolutely.
I mean, that's going to be valuable oral history.
Right.
That's going to leave us. Another area that I found fascinating are the older African Americans and the courage they had to live through segregation.
Well, I've run into that as well. I mean, I've often thought about that. Just meeting an older African American person in my childhood in Raleigh. I remember this in the Sears building in Cameron Village in Raleigh. There were white and colored water fountains. Downtown at the train station, there was a divider, a wooden divider in the midst of the lunch counter for black and white people. And so if you meet someone who was born, you know, in 1930, they lived the first at least 25 or 30 years of their lives in this community under very, very segregated conditions. And they can tell you what that was like, you know, and will, if you ask.
And I think it's good for them to talk about it. I am always amazed that they don't harbor lots of anger.
Right.
Because I think if I had been in a similar situation, I would have been angry as could be.
There was some degree of resignation. They never liked it. You know, I've heard that. It wasn't that they grew comfortable with it. There was just not a lot they could do, you know, about the separate movie theaters and the loss of opportunity.
Right,
you know,
education, all sorts of things.
I talked to people over in the Oberlin community of Raleigh, on a story I was working on, and they talked about having to work for people. The women in the community very often worked as domestics.
Right.
And they were often working for people who had less education than they did. And one woman I talked to said she worked for a woman who couldn't read and write. And she herself had gone to the Oberlin School, which was a wonderful school in its day, and graduated from college, I think. And yet that was her.
And she probably made $1 a day.
Yeah, it was. And then finally there's some more opportunities. Working at the prison was regarded as really a primo job because it was a state job. You had more benefits and all that. But it was very rough. I mean, of course, it was completely unjust, and you know, something of a mortification to the people who had to deal with it. But
if I might offer a suggestion, I actually think the newspaper would do well by running a series on some of these things because young people don't have any idea. I think
Yeah.
we need to do it so that we never do something like this again.
Right. And Oberlin is disappearing more and more all the time.
Absolutely.
There's a big new commercial office and office retail just right there on the end of it as you get towards Wade Avenue.
Right.
So fewer and
right.
fewer of the old buildings are left.
So what are some of your thoughts that expanding the program? Have you thought about long-range planning, or is that being done at this point?
Well, yes. And in fact, I mentioned earlier, I've been wanting to do a story for some time on what's called the Continuum of Care.
Mm-hmm.
And you know far
Right.
more about this than I, but for some of the viewers, the Continuum of Care for older people basically starts with someone who is older but lives independently and doesn't make use of other services necessarily, except for a doctor and
Right.
what anyone would have as a support system. And then as you move, as you grow, it's not necessarily older. As you have more difficulties with certain activities
Right.
of life, you can get levels of help, ranging from in-home help with what's called activities of daily life, bathing, dressing, toileting, as they call it, to all the way up to skilled nursing and hospice care. But there are many, many gradations and combinations of those services for people. There are many gradations and combinations of how you pay for it.
Right.
And unfortunately, as I heard today at a meeting in Raleigh, most people enter the system in crisis.
Right.
Either they themselves, the person, him or herself, or a relative is in the hospital, needs a place to live with assistance, and that can be at home with someone coming in, and there are needs for these residential facilities.
Tommy, I'm afraid we've run out of time.
No kidding.
It's been
Okay.
absolutely wonderful having you. Perhaps you'd come back again.
Oh, I'd love to.
Good.
Thank you
Because
so
I
much.
think informing people of what you have available is
And we plan to
wonderful.
have more and more of that and online resources
Great.
In the
Very
newspaper.
good. Thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it.
We're pulling our weight, learning the code, clicking our heels, sharing the load, and every so often we're hitting the road. Yeah, we're rocking. Well, I must be going, got a game at 3, then kids to be tutored, they're counting on me. It's a brand new century, and we're rocking. We paid our dues all those years, and it's so nice to be switching gears. It's a grand new century, and it's the senior life.